Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And welcome to our show. As we always like to start the show with, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. Randall, what's the easiest way to subscribe to the show?
Just go to our website, chrisandrandall.com, and there's links to everything on there.
That's right. That's the best way. If you are on YouTube, you can also subscribe for the latest notifications. I think most of the podcast formats will give you updates. If you're on Facebook, you're going to have to just check in. We post new episodes every Thursday, normally, around 3 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. And again, if you comment on something we've done on a past show, we're more than happy to answer your comments either in the comment box or maybe here on this program. All right, so before we even get any further into the show, I'm going to do something I've never done on this show, which is I'm going to start this show by reading a poem. Hey, it is arts and entertainment. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on those lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestals, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing else remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." And that is by Percy Bysshe Shelley, written in 1918. And what I really like about this poem, Randall, is that it addresses the impermanence. In that poem, you could say the impermanence of life, the impermanence of rule. But I also like to think that it also addresses the impermanence of art. And yet, I've just read a poem that was written 222 years ago, remains very much in the canon of popular poems by a poet almost all of us recognize. Which brings me to today's episode and the question I want to cover with you, which is, when we talk about what makes for great art, one of the criteria that's been very common is the concept of the test of time. That because something has been around for a long time, it must be great, or only great works survive the test of time. Is that a reasonable criterion for evaluating art? We're going to examine that over a series of questions in today's show. You ready, Randall?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's dive in. All right, well, I'll just start with the first question, and then you maybe take on the second one. So my question to you is it easier for some art forms to stand the test of time than others?
Oh, yes, of course. Well, you know, if a work of art can be put into a fixed form and copied, yes, of course. I mean, any kind of art that can degrade over time and you lose it to the ravages of time, you know, it's not going to survive. I mean, works need to be fixed, right? I mean, that's why most of the great works of art from antiquity are texts or statues. I mean, in antiquity, they worked in all sorts of media that we work in today even, right? I mean, they danced, they had fabrics, they had some painting. I mean, most of their paintings from antiquity have degraded. You know, have you ever looked at Pompeii? Have you ever seen any artifacts from Pompeii? So Pompeii is interesting because you don't think of the Roman Empire as full of paintings and art and decorations and everywhere, right? But it was. But most of that stuff's been destroyed or degraded over time. Roman statues, you know, we think of them as all white, right? But that's just because over time the paint wore off, and when us moderns discovered the statues or started looking at them, they were weathered, and with all the paint fallen away from time, right?
So on a physical level, there's always that to consider. There's also the fact that, you know, when you go to a museum and there is works of art from ancient civilizations, rarely do you know anything about the creator. It's normally what we like to call craft, often with the visual arts like pottery and sculpture and painting. So with the lack of an artist, we tend to think of it as just something made by all artisans of its day. There's a lack of story, except maybe for the subject. Certain things are lost because the language is lost, right? People don't know how to transcribe the stories because we don't know or we may know partially, but, you know, even things written in ancient Hebrew or any of the ancient languages, there's still scholarly debate over what certain key words and phrases mean, depending on that. So I would agree with you that I think, in fairness, song and writing are probably some of the harder things to survive, but I would argue visual art and sculpture, in my opinion, is the easiest, because when you look at art from antiquity that is sculpture more than anything else, you don't need to know the language, you don't need to know the maker, you don't need to know the subject. Much of it has survived, and because we're capable of understanding human form, it's a lot easier to, I think, appreciate sculpture.
Yeah, you definitely have a point, but I think the advantage writing has is it can be copied more readily, and even copied from language to language. I mean, the Bible is a great example, right? The Bible was translated to many languages, so it's it's survived. Maybe not completely intact, but it's survived more or less intact throughout thousands of years now.
And certainly you can look at the Bible as literature. And in that sense, if you look at the Bible, the Quran, the Old Testament, or Greek mythology, you're right. I mean, there is story that transcends oral storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
So mythology, which comes from oral storytelling, which changes even from teller to teller. So there's no, at some point, it doesn't even matter who the original authors of these narratives are, because they take on a life of their own. And they survive through the various interpretations.
Well, it's interesting to talk about authorship, because, you know, as time goes on, I think that people become less and less obsessed with authorship, right? I mean,
well, actually, I would argue the opposite. I think authorship, when we talk about things that are less than 1,000 years, or the bulk of what we'll be talking about today is works where we know who the author of the work is. But I just wanted to cover at least why certain things are not going to get the discussion that they might merit. Whereas I will say it's much easier to talk about how popular art has or has not stood the test of time, such as any artwork created from the 19th century on. Fine art that you see in museums, we can talk about that because that's easier to gauge. Do you think that avant-garde work stands the test of time because it is so peculiar to its own time that people just spend all these generations of time trying to unlock its mysteries?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that when it comes to avant-garde work, I think most of the avant-garde work, I mean, this is just my opinion, look reading about art over the years. So my opinion on avant-garde work is that the avant-garde work that carries on and stands the test of time, it usually comes on the tail end of a medium that's dying, I think. Like, for instance, you take the theater. So some of the greatest plays in the theater come after TV, I would think, and after radio, right? So you're talking about a period.
No, actually, I would say avant-garde theater exists pretty much from the 19th century on. And some of the great avant-garde works like Uber Roy, they start at the beginning of the 20th century. Modernism really is, no offense, but not that there isn't avant-garde work that happens in the 60s and 70s. I'm just saying that even those groups come out of avant-garde work that predates even film. But,
right. Well, I mean, the radio starts, I don't know what a good date for the radio starting is, but the 1920s for sure, right? I mean,
yes, absolutely. But like Schoenberg's 12 tonal scale, for example, or Stravinsky's The Rites of Spring. We've talked about these before as like early avant-garde works. Maybe it is, I would argue, maybe part of the timelessness of those books, or even something like Ulysses by James Joyce, is that they're so impenetrable in their day, that people will just keep on going back to it until they can figure out what's going on.
Right, but I mean, you even look at like Ulysses. That's a good example of what I'm talking about. Novels start with Don Quixote, right? We're talking about.
Some people believe so. Yeah.
So I'm not sure what years I've read. The 1800s.
1800s. Yeah. Some people think that Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, which is the first English novel, but those two both are products of the 17th century. So yeah.
Right, and so by the time we get to Ulysses, we're at the tail end of a very popular medium that's now being eclipsed by in mass entertainment, in popularity by other mediums, and so that's when you have an opening for avant-garde art, I feel. And
no, that's a very good point. Avant-garde art is, I agree with you. It's a deconstruction of established art, right?
Right.
So basically, avant-garde artwork standing the test of time. There's this wonderful saying by Salvador Dalí, an avant-garde artist, that, first they call you a radical and then they put you in a museum. So
did Dalí say that?
Yeah, Dalí.
I thought it was Gandhi. That. Okay, I don't know.
It's Dalí, and that's the thing that I think we'll get to this again. We'll come back to this question about.
Well, I guess you can't have avant without the guard, right?
That's right. Well, I want to come back to avant to art that challenges its society a bit. I just want to get some more basic questions done first. So, on an aesthetic level, are there some common traits that long-lasting artwork shares?
Yes.
What do you think they are?
Well, should we list some arts that we think are?
Yeah, like I mean, yeah. You were talking about capturing reality, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah. Previously, we were discussing. I think that something that classic works all seem to have in common is they're able to capture the reality of the human experience and accurately. You read like Shakespeare. You look at a classic movie. Read a classic novel. They're able to capture the nuance of the human experience in a way it's almost like looking at a window, right, into the human mind. I mean, they're quite it's a transcendent experience almost, right? I mean, one of my favorite books is Catcher in the Rye, and reading that book for me was like I felt like I was in the mind of Holden Caulfield, right? He felt like a real person with a real mind, and that's the kind of thing that that classic works can do. They do. I mean, that's why they become classics.
Would you say then that in humanism, you're talking about not just physical reality, but you're also talking about psychological reality and emotional reality, such as operas. Operas are, in many senses, or song in general, or poetry, can deal with heightened levels of emotional reality, things that we may not really ever live, but in our minds and in our hearts, we experience.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I tend to think of science as trying to capture objective external reality, right? but art is trying to capture internal reality, the internal reality of the human mind. And when
it certainly can, yeah.
And when you look at great art, you are understanding the mind of another person.
So then in that sense, when we are looking at something that is from a completely different society, from a completely different time, the connective nature of it is rooted in our shared humanity.
Yes, that's the amazing thing about reading a classic work from thousands of years ago. You can see the commonalities that you have with people who lived thousands of years ago. It's an amazing experience to read a work like that and just realize that nothing much has changed, and you're just like those people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in that sense, I feel like metaphysical questions that we struggle with today. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be bad? What does it mean to be honest, to be true? Human beings have been struggling with this forever. And art, in numerous ways, allows the artist to vent or opine or imagine or declaim or declare these metaphysical questions. Sadly, there has not been a single definitive answer to these metaphysical questions, which is why the work continues to be relevant today. If there was answers, then I guess these metaphysical questions would no longer matter.
Well, I don't know if there are answers. I don't know if it's even a question. It's just things just are the way they are, right? And these works, usually classic works, they are able to capture the state of things in an accurate way, I feel. I mean, I'm not sure if there is a puzzle to life. There is only life, right?
But you could argue that a lot of the reason why art survives the test of time is because the artist does not have the last piece of the puzzle, which is, like I said, about avant-garde art. And it's dealing with the inability to put that last piece of the puzzle together that we as human beings are still struggling with. However, I don't want to lean just into narrative art. I want to really talk about harmony and symmetry and just elements of technique. If you think about it in music, there are just certain notations, certain chords and choruses that are just more resonant to our brains and psyches than more dissonant sounds. You can hear it in poetry. When you look at painting, there's something about finding really interesting forms of symmetry or asymmetry that challenge how we look or hear, right? Or they're chance. There's reassuring nature in repetition.
Well,
I'm sorry, I just want to finish my thought, which is that on some level, you could argue that it's not just simply an emotional or intellectual experience, but art can also be just a physical experience. There's something about a beat of a drum in a particular way that you cannot rationally explain why that beat of that rhythm or goes through your head and you need to hear it again and again and again. Right. I mean, I've been watching a lot of Rick Beato on what makes a song great. And one thing that he does that's really interesting is because he's also a music teacher, he will just talk about why certain chord structures compositionally have existed throughout major works of music through the last 500 years. So we could also say there's a psychological element of fascination or enthrallment that makes art stand the test of time.
Well, I think maybe part of what you're getting at here is just the technique of art, the artifice of art, just the quality of manufacturing of the art. And I think that when you start looking at classics, you start to see that many classic works come out of periods and eras and areas where there's an industrialization of art, where you have a division of labor of artisans, many people involved in the creation of art, and they're churning out lots and lots of art. Okay, like you can look at Roman statues, you know, so the Roman Empire commissioned artisans to make these statues, you know, and they churned out tons and tons of them. You look at the theater during different eras and periods.
So let me just stop you right there, because I just want to kind of follow where you're heading, because you're almost in a different question, and not a bad one, which is, are there other things besides the sheer aesthetic quality of a work of art that allow it to survive?
Well, I think
you're talking right now about the industrialization of art. Why don't you just elaborate a little further on that?
Well, yeah, I just think the aesthetics of the art is definitely, the quality of the aesthetics is influenced by an industrial process. You know, if there is one. I mean, if
so you want to talk about like class, let's talk about symphonies.
Okay. So yeah, so there was a time, when would you say, like the 1600s, 1500s, you would say, on when symphonies became popular in Europe. And so every city,
definitely by the 17th century, or by the 18th century, certainly by the 18th century, it was a commercial medium.
It became a popular art form, and every little city wanted to have their own symphony if they could, and they all built amazing theaters for the appreciation of music, and instruments were codified, and musical notations codified, and your role in the creation of symphonic music would become very defined. You know, there wouldn't be a person who would be a composer and a player and a symphony builder all at once, right? I mean, you'd
right. Well,
one of those.
It's been around for hundreds of years, but it existed more in royal courts. And instead of being just the privy of the wealthiest patrons, a church, a monarch, or the wealthiest members of nobility or the merchant class, now it became a cultural institution. It became really, in a weird way, mass entertainment. So now you have these giant symphonic halls built for everyone, regardless of their money, to come and sit in a large acoustically built auditorium where, you know, this was like the big IMAX theaters of its day. You know, this, in many senses, this was the great form of popular entertainment. And cities, as you say, cities would pride themselves on it. Nations would pride themselves on their own national composers. Symphonic orchestras would pride themselves on their ability to interpret great works. Beethoven is a wonderful example. He's 19th century, but you know, Beethoven, everybody knows Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Dum, 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 dum. That's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. If you know nothing about classical artwork, music, you know that, right? Mm-hmm. Well, when it first premiered, the orchestra didn't play it properly. The audience was cold and uncomfortable, and the initial reviews of it, which did not travel far, were not particularly solid. A year and a half afterwards, a very famous music critic named ETA Hoffman, writing anonymously, starts writing high praise for the work. And slowly but surely, it gets produced by symphonies both in Europe and in the United States. And it becomes, and this is a great example of the role of the critic, how critics are often the reason why works of art get elevated past obscurity, or elevated among their initial reactions, or why those works of art then become the artwork that other theaters will produce or perform, or why they end up in textbooks, right? The role of the critic.
Right. Well, the critic's role is really one of cultivation, right? They have taste, they sift through a lot of works, and they decide, or they have good taste, so they know what is good and what is bad, right? I mean, that's the idea. So, you know, and
so therefore, once you really get, I would argue, certainly into the 19th century, right through today, I would say that the role of the critic in ensuring what makes it into the canon of works that survive the test of time. Really, you can go all the way back to the 16th century, but I'll just say by the 18th century, it just became the standard. You know, the juries, prizes, awards, scholarly research. These were the intermediating factors that really started to say, not only is this work made by somebody who was talented, not only is this financially successful or popular today, but it's going to be in the canon because we as critics see something in it that the average person may not be able to appreciate. And then we will articulate it in the presses or what other mediums we have. And then other people will go, oh, well, now that someone who really has dedicated themselves to aesthetics theory has stated it such, it just tends to travel on.
Well, I think that
which is not to say it's undeserved, just to be clear. It could be undeserved, but I'm not saying at this point it is.
Well, I don't know. I think it is deserved. I think that the critics, the reason critics are good is because they listen to everything. I mean, that's the whole point. And the way you develop taste, good taste in art or anything is you experience everything, right? So the problem with an average audience person, the average audience member, is they haven't seen everything.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're an average audience person from like 1750 and you've never heard a Beethoven symphony, you might dismiss it out of hand. You might say, Beethoven, who's that? I don't care. Right. But if you're a critic, you've heard Beethoven and you know he's the best, right?
But, yeah, exactly. And that helps propel them to, and it's certainly not undeserved. Obviously, it would not have lasted as long today if those critics had not been onto something when they said, da 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 da. Yeah, that's great music.
You know, a primary role, I think, of curation and critics in art, criticism in art, is saving the audience time. You know, they can present to the audience, the mass audience, what's good, and tell them to stay away from what's bad. And,
go ahead.
And the audience doesn't have to sift through everything, right? I mean, we're kind of losing that in the age of the internet.
That's kind of where you even see it in a Yelp review for a restaurant, or in Rotten Tomatoes, you know, or Goodreads, or Rolling Stone's top pick, or Pitchfork. You're absolutely right. But also keep in mind, like, for example, there are the works of art that fail in its own time, even by the critics. Citizen Kane came out, and it not only did it not do well financially, it received very poor critical reviews. Now, some would say it received poor critical reviews and it did not do well financially because of the meddling of William Randolph Hearst, who controlled newspapers and critics. So they could say that, oh, it was really a great work of art, but the power over the critic was someone like Hearst, who controls the presses. And he would just threaten theaters to not put on the film, and he would threaten the newspapers not to write good, to write good reviews. He owned the papers that wrote the bad reviews. But that said, in the late 50s, the French Cahiers du Cinéma, I can never pronounce them correctly.
Yeah,
but when there became a second movement in film criticism, the one that is basically the primary form of criticism even today, they considered it to be a lost classic. And it was only really 15 years after the film came out that Citizen Kane started its rapid ascension to now where the AFI considers it to be the greatest film of all time. So even critics in their own day may fail to see the genius of a work of art, but then you would argue that another group of critics will come along and revisit it. In that sense, again, avant-garde art is really a great example of this, because avant-garde art may not even do well with the critics in its own day. You were talking, this is not avant-garde art, but I wanted to get to this because it seems like the good time to do so. Let's talk about The Great Gatsby.
All right, yeah, the Great Gatsby, you want me to tell you the genesis of how it became a classic is, so I believe the story goes, it's been a while since I read about it, but when The Great Gatsby was released, it was in the during the Roaring '20s. It wasn't very popular. It kind of like came and went. Nobody really paid much attention to it. And then World War II happens. During World War II, all the GIs were stationed overseas. They had nothing to do. One of the things the government did was print out a bunch of old paperbacks, whatever they could find, and send them as part of the rations to all the GIs. And the GIs started reading. They had nothing to do, so they read all these paperbacks, all these books, and I guess the story goes the number one book that the GIs loved the most was The Great Gatsby.
20 years roughly after it had come out, been written, Fitzgerald had successes with other books, but that book, and now that's the book that everybody reads in high school,
Right.
or
So
college.
the GIs would if they liked a book, they would start passing their copy around, sharing it to people. And so copies of The Great Gatsby from World War II are like almost impossible to find apparently because they've been read through so many times. and when they came back, it's like suddenly The Great Gatsby was all the rage. Everybody loved it.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point, because certainly it is today one of the great. It's certainly everyone's going to encounter it. Everyone is going to, when you ask yourself what's a great work of fiction that everyone can agree on, they'll say The Great Gatsby, not just because it's called The Great Gatsby. And that actually leads me to a second group, which is I think the other forces that may also contribute to the longevity of a work of art, like critics, is academics. Because these books are taught in school, we canonize them because they're being taught in school. Now, you could argue they're being taught in school because they are inherently great works, and either as for national identity or cultural enrichment, you want to make sure that students are aware of what the great works of art are. You could argue to teach kids how to be better writers, you have them read good books, because you can look at Fitzgerald's prose style, and you can say, if you look at the way he writes, you can become a better writer yourself. He was a great prose stylist. That's a really fair argument. You can use The Great Gatsby to teach history and say we are using the great art to show how people lived in society. You can use Gatsby to explore the metaphysical issues of identity or romance or love. Or you can use it for moral, which I find the hardest one. But I think there is certainly a lot of books, not Gatsby, but there are a lot of books, I would argue, and Gatsby certainly has been used for it. They exist in the canon not because they themselves are excellent work of aesthetics, but because there's a moral value that has been inculcated in the work that the educators want to put upon their children. This is what I call the Johnny Tremain effect, right?
You're referring to the novel Johnny Tremain.
You're going to have to when we were kids, everyone had to come across this incredibly boring novel that, in my opinion, has no reason to exist whatsoever. And yet, somehow, for the longest time, people who came up with the reading list for small children thought, wow, the moral values of Johnny Tremain make this a worthwhile read.
Yeah, I mean, you might be right about that. I do think that almost all works considered part of the canon that are classics, that are considered classics, I do think they all have merit. Okay, I think that on
Johnny
their own,
Tremain?
That's the toughest one, but I haven't read it in a long time,
I dare somebody, please, right now, say, I'm a grown man or a grown woman, and I have reread this book, and man, oh man, this is a wonderful, it's like the book that more people are aware of that is equally like this is Last of the Mohicans by Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe is not a great writer by any stretch. He's an entertaining writer, but he was never considered a great writer, and yet somehow he snuck his way into the American reading list. So we treat him as if he was a writer of great work, but he isn't. Again, if you love Daniel Defoe, please, come on. Another factor I really think that when we talk about it is national identity, right? America is a little harder to deal with because I think we have so much art, but you can see other cultures who they consider to be their great artists are often quite particular to their own culture.
Yeah, frequently there's like a propagandistic classic that that is foisted upon kids in a particular country's educational system, right? It's sort of a way of creating a national unity, inculcating national values into all the populace. Like Johnny Tremain is probably the best example of that, right?
Yeah.
Johnny Tremain is supposed to be, every kid's supposed to read it in school and then understand what it means to be an American or something
Right.
like
Every American kid, right? So if you're living in another country, God love you, you're not going to have to deal with Johnny Tremain. You may not even have to deal with The Great Gatsby, because technically speaking, The Great Gatsby is considered an American tragedy. So it's really considered what it's like. So much of the works of art that Americans love all have to do with what it's like to be an American.
You know,
and not just in novels, but in songs, in the visual arts, in sculpture. So much of what we consider to be contemporary great art is only because it reflects back to us our experiences as Americans in America. But what if you live in Peru, or what if you live in Taiwan? Do they not have their own great art that has stood the test of time? But because we are an exceptionalist society, we just don't acknowledge it?
Possibly. But you know, a lot of it, nationalistic, propagandistic art is just it's an attempt, right? It's an attempt at creating a national identity, and as we've already covered here, it usually it fails.
But no, not really, I would argue. And this, I disagree with you. I think there's a couple things to unlock. I do think that there is some really great art in other cultures that has stood the test of time in their cultures, but we're not a culture that really allows other things that aren't. We tend to be exceptionalist. We tend to not recognize what is considered a work of great cultural artwork in a society not our own. So much of what we consider to be the great works of art past a certain period in history simply reflect our own cultural taste. Now, I will say, Mussolini, when he was ruling Italy as a fascist, he did believe that Italy should go back and look at its great works of art and use that as a national identity. But I would also argue that every president of the United States has something like Reagan had those Remington sculptures of cowboys, or we look at the painting of George Washington. You know, we have nationalistic art, and this is not to say that the art that embodies the spirit of our society or America or our famous heroes is good or is bad art. I'm just saying it stands the test of time, not just for Americans. It may stand the test of time for people who don't live in America, but maybe that's also because we're so popular. And I apologize, but I want to bring up Mona Lisa. So you can talk about, and you hopefully will, why Da Vinci was a great artist and why the Mona Lisa is a great work of art. Have you seen the Mona Lisa, Randall?
Not in person, no.
It's quite lovely. And would you agree it is do you like Da Vinci?
Yes, yeah. I mean, his skill was unsurpassed.
Absolutely. I don't think for a second anyone would really argue that he was not a great artist and his work did not naturally stand the test of time. But in my research, because I wanted to have a good standard of what everyone can agree upon in the world of visual art, I did not know that part of why he became so popular in the 20th century was because in 1911, the painting was stolen from the Louvre. It was in all the newspapers, and that attracted attention outside of France. And then in the 1930s, the French government loaned the Mona Lisa to the museum, the Metropolitan Museum of New York. And it was a very big event. People came from all over the United States to watch it, to look at it. And then over the last century, the French government has consistently lent this painting out on loan to other parts of the world, so that now 9 million people every year go to the Louvre. 80% of those people just go to see the Mona Lisa. And if you ever, I've been there, it's insane. It is literally there's like a separate line and a glass booth and everything. So it's possible that had it never been stolen and had the French government not invested as much time into gaining notoriety for the work of art, it would still be considered a very large and significant work of art, but it would not have this kind of celebrity status that no other painting really can enjoy. So, I mean, to me, those are outside forces. Let's bring this to a more personal space. What do you, I mean, can we think what has in your own life been like stood the test of time with you? What is, in other words, so like just personally speaking, what do you think that you liked when you were younger that you still like today?
It's funny you asked me this question. I was talking to some of my coworkers who are teenagers, because I'm a lifeguard, and asking them what books, novels they read in high school.
Yeah.
And they're reading like The Great Gatsby and Of Mice and Men.
Yeah.
And Brave New World. And one of them never heard of 1984.
Oh my God. Well, that's okay. They're young. They're teens. They may run into that in college.
And they haven't read Treasure Island. They never, they haven't read Mark Twain. What?
They have horrible parents. That's not their fault.
But I'm just surprised that because these are works I was thinking back to works I remembered fondly, books I remembered fondly, and wondering what they were reading, wondering if anything's changed, and not much has changed, I guess. And I'm still surprised that they make the kids read The Great Gatsby. I mean, that's not something that I think is good for high school kids to read.
Well, like you pick. Go ahead. It's not good for high school kids to read.
Well, I don't think they can understand it. And when I asked them, they didn't like it that much. You know what they liked of Mice and Men?
What?
I remember kids liking that a lot. Brave New World. I don't think anybody liked that one.
Oh no.
But I'm just, it just surprises me that they make the kids read books that I don't know if the kids are going to like. So what's the point?
That is a really good point. And I think I want to answer it for myself too, which is that if you have a good education, if you have good parents, your mom is a librarian, my mom is an art teacher, so we both are, unfortunately, culture was, we had no choice. We were born into culture. But I feel that and I don't mean that as a slam on you, you've met my mom and I've met your mom. It's not a slam on our moms. But at a very early age, we had introduction to a lot of these great works of art that have stood the test of time. And I do feel, and I'll pick on Gatsby because most of us have read Gatsby at one point or another in our life. And why not? Gatsby's a good one to go with. And I'll pick on Beethoven's Fifth. You've all seen Beethoven's Fifth. And you've all probably seen Mona Lisa, if not Google it. I'm going to pick on these three, right? So you're introduced to them when you're such a young child. And you don't really have a lot of self-knowledge. You don't really know a lot about the world. You don't know a lot about yourself. You like vanilla ice cream. You like Rocky Road ice cream. You like cartoons. You like
the black crayon a lot.
You like the black crayon a lot. You like, yummy, 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 I got love in my tummy, or whatever song by Rihanna. Your tastes are very primitive and simple. And here is an adult saying, this is good art. And I'll prove it to you by making you sit down and listen to it against your will. Or worse, I'll make you write a paper on it. So I do think that it is an interesting experience when, I don't remember when, maybe when I was in my 30s, I started going to the Hollywood Bowl to see the LA Philharmonic play mostly what is the standards of classical music. And I was sitting outside. If you've ever been, it's an outdoor concert venue in the summertime under a band shell. They have some of the great conductors and guest soloists and guest conductors. And they play all of your major classical. But to sit outside as a grown man and to hear the melodies, the harmonies, the structures, the meters, and the time live with a full symphony. And I've heard Beethoven's Fifth quite a bit there. all of a sudden I get it. You know what I'm saying? All of a sudden I get it. I remember when I saw Mona Lisa. I was in Europe at the Louvre. I was 21 years old. And because my mom had shown me paintings since I was 6 or 5, I was very familiar with Mona Lisa. But I looked at it and I'm like, oh, I get it. And I have had so many classes with the Great Gatsby from junior high right through to college. But every year, I will either read it, or I'll hear an audio version, or I'll have a discussion, or there's a beautiful. Do you remember the paragraph that talks about Daisy and Tom Buchanan?
Yeah, I think a lot of high school kids have to literally write an essay on that paragraph.
Right, and how their love, they just didn't care about other people. They just, they were just all. Well, I don't remember the exact Latin, and I can't recall it for verbatim. But every time, I remember about 2 years ago, I put that paragraph down as how I felt about Donald Trump and his wife.
Mm-hmm.
That to me, it sums them up, and the fact that I can still find relevance, are there any second acts in America? I don't know, like the resonance of it. And yeah, the older I get, the more I appreciate it, because the older I get, the further a great work of art is something that's foisted upon me and is something that I choose to seek out myself. Yeah, and then I mean, we have also the converse, right? You've seen things in your life that have just fallen into obscurity.
Like, what do you mean? Like,
well, things that in their day were critically acclaimed, but now just seem so dated.
Yeah, I mean, well, should I bring up Gore Vidal and his? Gore Vidal, he wrote an essay. He's written many essays, but he wrote an essay about bestsellers once, talking about how bestsellers are are almost always forgotten after the year they're published.
Yeah.
And classic books are almost never bestsellers. And Gore Vidal, I think he wrote that essay like in the 60s or something. I mean, so nothing's really changed. And I think in the essay, he even lists, he even writes down the top bestsellers from the last 10 years. And seriously, it's titles you've never heard of these books.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to say that, because I've just recently gotten into reading the books of Eric Ambler. And if you don't know who Eric Ambler is, that's probably because you're under 70. So Eric Ambler was a mystery novelist. He mostly wrote spy novels, and he mostly wrote, if not spy novels, things like spy novels, thrillers, from the 1930s to the early 70s. And he was exceedingly popular in his day. Several of his books were made into movies. And I only know this because my mom told me, who's in her 80s, that when she was a young woman, all the adults read Eric Ambler. Even people her age read Eric Ambler. And then sometime in the last 40 plus years, people just stopped reading Eric Ambler. And then one day, I just happened to see a really cool looking cover on a vintage reprise. So I bought the book. It was like $5. And I was like, oh my God, this is an amazingly well-written, funny, good page turner. And now one of my great hobbies is to find out-of-print Eric Ambler novels, read them, and I love them. And in a fairy universe, Eric Ambler would have the same career as Graham Greene. Graham Greene was a contemporary of Ambler, but people who know who Greene is, his work stands the test of time in that he's critically recognized. But Ambler, for whatever reason, because maybe his books are funny and less spiritual, they're considered slight. And that's a shame. Is there somebody that you feel should have stood the test of time but hasn't? Or you'd like to bring into the...
I don't know. I'm such a traditionalist, Chris, in this respect. I mean, I love the classics. Whenever I read a work that's deemed a classic, I always feel like I see the genius in it, and I understand why it's a classic. I mean, maybe I agree with you on Johnny Tremain, but
so
for the most part, yeah.
How about humor? Do you think humor stands the test of time?
I generally do. I generally do. I mean, I feel like have you ever read any plays by Aristophanes?
Yep, I've read The Clouds, and I think it's
Lysistrata?
hysterical. Not as fun, but I get where you're going with it. Certainly classical farce, and that's low humor. Low humor physical comedy seems to have stood the test of time well. And then Moliere, very witty wordplay. He seems to have stood this test of time very well. Oscar Wilde has stood the test of time very well. So in some senses, I agree with you. But look at this other way. What we considered funny at the time, as we get a more nuanced, more morally advanced society, may not be funny anymore. So then I think the problem with humor is because humor is inherently can be offensive, can challenge cultural norms. It's easier probably for humor more than anything else to fall out of relevance.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. A lot of the biggest comedies of the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, if you watch them again today, some of it is just cringeworthy. It's just not that funny because the jokes were very relevant to its time, but now our understanding is not that funny. I love Monty Python, but all the gay humor now just seems silly and offensive at best.
You know, I didn't know
because I don't think being gay in and of itself is a funny thing.
Yeah, I've
Or
never
being when they used to do the foreigners, like, oh, I'm a German or I'm Pakistani and I'm going to talk with their funny accents. I'm like, that's just straight up racist. I'm not saying I don't love Monty Python, but the older I get, the more I can go, that joke did not travel well.
Yeah, I mean, I've never appreciated humor like that actually. So I don't know.
I mean, critically believed in its day. A lot of this stuff today, it's just not funny, and yet other stuff is. So I mean, I think that is music. I think because music is so dependent on harmony, it doesn't suffer this way. And I think artwork. I think that sometimes people just, in critics and scholars, will just say, well, we're not into Rockwell anymore because Norman Rockwell is too illustrative. But then years later, they'll go, oh, Rockwell's really good. But it's very rare that a work of art can be so easily canceled out like humor. I'm not saying it's bad or it's good. I'm just saying I feel that humor is one of the hardest arts to preserve.
I mean, I see what you're getting at, but I don't know. I love low humor. That's my favorite. I mean, give me the Three Stooges.
Okay, not my cup. Do you feel that? The author has to stand the test of time for the art to stand the test of time?
No, I definitely believe that people forget about the author like almost immediately. I mean, what do we know about Shakespeare? Almost nothing. I mean, nobody cares apparently.
Well, then how about contemporary artists who have made works that we now consider to be, the great classics, but now we know that they were horrible people?
Well, I think with time, all these works will be evaluated on their own merits, which is what happens to all works of art that survive in a fixed form. Another thing to consider, I want to say, is any kind of masterpiece from antiquity, there are usually other works from that era that people just completely forgot about because they're terrible.
Well, like I'll make it simpler. So like Michael Jackson, right?
Uh-huh.
Michael Jackson, so many songs you hear on the radio, and songs that we've heard from 40, 50 years now, and yet now we know things about him that he was just a horrible human being.
Well, given enough time, maybe, but given enough time, no one is going to even remember Michael Jackson. They're only going to remember the music.
Actually, I was going to say the opposite is true, which is that even in our era today, knowing what we know about Michael Jackson, we seem to divorce what we know about him from listening to his music. Most people I know still listen to Michael Jackson, knowing full well that as a human being, he was a horrible human being, but as a singer of song, he was gifted, and we just separate. And again, you can't say, unlike it's easy to pick on somebody who was a terrible person, who was a great novelist, because I just like the novel. I don't think about the person who wrote it. But in order to technically enjoy a singer, you have to kind of grant that singer some degree of like, well, I like the sound of their voice. And the fact that you could like the sound of the voice or the dance moves of somebody who's a thoroughly horrible. Now, in fairness, our age group, we didn't know that Michael Jackson was a horrible person when those songs came out. We only really knew he was a horrible person after we had spent so much time listening to his music that it was already embedded into our likes. But I wonder, do you think younger people coming down the line will listen to Michael Jackson because they'll already know what a horrible person he is along with the music?
Well, like I said, I think people they're not going to care. Enough time will pass, no one will care.
I don't know. I don't know if that's the case. I mean, Woody Allen is now, if you're a younger person, you already know everything there is to know about Woody Allen. Are you going to now sit through his films? No one really goes to, Woody Allen films are no longer released in this country. Do you even go back to watch Woody Allen films anymore now that you know what you know about him?
100 years from now, Woody Allen movies will be all over Amazon Prime 3000.
But I don't know. I don't think so. Look, one of my favorite films of all time by Woody Allen is Manhattan. Now, when it came out, I was 13. So my understanding of the 17-year-old girl is she was an adult. So for me, a 17-year-old girl and a 42-year-old man, 13-year-old Chris Corbell, it didn't register. And I would go back and watch it over and over. And somehow, even as I got older, I would glide over. I'd love the cinematography by Gordon Willis. I'd love this beautiful musical score directed by the New York Philharmonic. I would love the performance by Diane Keaton. There were so many elements that made me love that film. But now, knowing what I know about Woody Allen, at the age I am now, I can no longer say that film stands the test of time with me. Maybe Sleeper is a movie I could watch forever because there's nothing about Sleeper that really forces me to deal with Woody Allen as he truly is. But I do think that cancel culture is a valid, and look at that, we got the cancel culture and the test of time. So let's hit it. There is a movement to replace certain people from the canon, either because they were horrible people or because the canon isn't reflective of all voices. We've had this discussion.
Yes. Well, I reiterate my standard argument on this is that great works are great because of their own inherent merit. And I stand by that. I mean, you want to look at the canon and say, oh, well, it matters who the authors are. Well, you gotta find authors that have the proper ethnic backgrounds, the proper whatever backgrounds you're looking for. Good luck, I mean,
I don't know if I agree with you. I think that if in fairness, there were probably authors in history who were very good at what they did, but because they were a woman or because they were not white or because they did not have the right connections, their work came out, but they would not be discovered in their own time. Emily Dickinson was not discovered in her own time, but now we all read her. So certainly, isn't that part of the scholarly work of
I think
academia to rescue great works from obscurity? And some of the blockage to being great work is that you're the wrong person to publish great work?
Right, but
it's not that you're not without talent. It's because who you are is a barrier to entry into mainstream.
Well, yes, but the reason I would say that Emily Dickinson's poetry became studied and popular is because it's good. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that she's a woman.
But then the argument is really not that you're replacing people in the canon with people who are simply there because they fill an identity hole. You're replacing them with people who have equal levels of talent but have not been previously represented in the canon.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that argument, but I just don't buy it. I think works that stand the test of time, that are classic, they're part of the canon, it's because they're good. You know, and Emily Dickinson, she didn't need a modern cancel culture decolonization movement to be included in the canon because
Well,
she
this
wrote
is
good stuff.
certainly,
Neither did
it's
Oscar
certainly,
Wilde, by the way. And Oscar Wilde's a gay man.
yeah.
And they didn't exclude him because he was gay. They included him because his work is great.
Well, I mean, this is another point, which is that something stand the test of time mean nothing, and nothing can go in the test of time? Certainly something that came out 20 or 30 years ago in our own lifetime can now be, depending on what art form, can now be defined as a classic, right? I mean, like, I watched TCM, and now all of a sudden I'm seeing movies that I saw as a grown man in the 80s and the 90s considered a classic. Are they classics? Am I hesitant to call them a classic because they occurred in my lifetime? Do you feel there's a bias that you have? Can something that came out in your lifetime be considered a classic?
Well, reflection is always hindsight's always 2020, right? I mean, 1,000 years from now, it's it's way easier to look
But
back
in
on
your
the
own
movies.
time, I mean, like, we did an episode on video games, I remember, and video game stories. And I did my research, and they were talking about like what the great hypertext games were. And they were all like, no, they were all from the 21st century. You know, like even within hypertext storytelling, you know, it's less than 20 years of here are the classics, which makes perfectly sense because it's a very new art form. But, you know, I guess time and the test of time is relative to how old the art form is.
Well, people, I mean, going back to our conversation about propagandistic art, I mean, people are trying to, sometimes they're trying to, they, they, they want to push through an ideology, right? So they're going to select works. Like if your ideology, if you want to claim that video games are a great art form, you're going to want to find the masterpieces. And honestly, you got slim pickings because yes, it's young, but also because you know, the technology of video games has changed so much in such a little tiny amount of time. You know, it's really tough for you to pick through it and find the works that you want to claim are masterpieces.
Well, I think that you have to keep in mind that everything is relative to the time that it occurs. So I know for a fact I have a bias against seeing anything created as a new work of art if it happened in my own lifetime, because I'm so used to viewing works of art as not. I, 5 years ago, went to the theater and I saw a Tony Award winning drama called The Humans. And I enjoyed it thoroughly because I enjoyed it thoroughly because this play, which was about a family in our era, was dealing with what it's like to be alive today. And so much of the story was about things that only happen today. In fact, that same year, I saw another play called Charles the King, about Prince Charles ascending the throne. And it was a beautiful play about what would happen if Charles became King of England. And there's all this court intrigue between William and Kate. And these plays are great, but they're great because they address what it's like to be alive today. And built into these plays is a sense of obsolescence, meaning none of these plays were written to be appreciated outside of their own time. And I don't know, as an artist, if we should really be creating works of art thinking about whether or not this will last the test of time. And I don't even know if, in fairness, can art just be great that's great within its own time and then fades into obscurity?
Well, obviously, yes. I mean, art is always, there's lots of works that are great in their own time and then fade into obscurity. So, I mean, that happens all the time, right?
So, yeah. So, yes. But I don't, but I'm just saying, I'm glad that those plays were written, just like there's pop songs that come out today and I'm sure a teenager is going to fall in love with that will just disappear later on and they'll just have that happy experience. I mean, maybe it's the ephemeral nature. And the best example of this is live performance. So we had a whole other episode on it, but I want to bring it back. When you're catching a live performance, it won't stand the test of time. It only exists for that moment. And in that moment, it's quite beautiful, like the rose that reaches fruition and then dies. And it's so strange because obviously no one knows when they're making art or watching art what's going to stand the test of time. Man, do you have anything else to add to this conversation?
No, I think we covered it like 6 ways to Sunday here.
Okay, well, I really want to hear what you guys think. Yes, we're middle-aged white men, like what we like. We have very particular points of views. We have our biases. We have our belief in traditions. It doesn't mean that we're not open to you taking us on and disagreeing with us or agreeing with us, nothing more than like having people go right on, right on. Until then, this was a long one and a difficult one. I really appreciate you sticking with us. I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
We'll talk soon.